Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. It is a privilege to have you with us as we open the file on another complex and compelling case. Today, we examine a plan that began with Greeda's seemingly straightforward bank heist designed for a clean getaway. But in the volatile world of armed robbery, the line between control and chaos is perilously thin. A series of critical errors and unforeseen complications would escalate the situation, turning a calculated grab for cash into a tense standoff that ended in bloodshed. We will investigate the moments that turned a heist into a homicide. Case 1. The North Hollywood Shootout. The story of the North Hollywood Shootout does not begin on the morning of February 28, 1997. It begins years earlier, in the shared obsessions and calculated ambitions of two men, Larry Eugene Phillips Jr. and Emil Disciple Matasareanu. Theirs was a partnership forged not in friendship, but in a mutual and methodical dedication to the craft of armed robbery. They were not common thugs. They saw themselves as professionals, students of a violent art form. Larry Phillips was the architect, the strategist. A career criminal with a history of residential burglaries and a deep, almost academic fascination with firearms, he was intelligent and meticulous. He understood ballistics, penetration, and the tactical application of firepower. Phillips spent countless hours modifying weapons, converting legal semi-automatic rifles like the Norinco Type 56 Sporter and a Bushmaster XM-15 into illegal, fully automatic weapons of war. He was not merely arming himself, he was creating a system designed to overwhelm any conceivable opposition. His philosophy, which he drilled into his partner, was simple and chilling. Excessive force is always adequate. Emil Matasareanu was the apprentice, the muscle, but he was far from a simple follower. A large, physically imposing man, he had once aspired to own a business. But a series of personal and financial failures, coupled with the diagnosis of a severe brain ailment that left him with seizures, pushed him toward a path of desperation. His mother's mounting medical bills became a powerful, if misguided, motivation. When he met Phillips at a Gold's Gym in Venice, California, he found a mentor who offered a solution path that promised vast rewards through meticulous, high-risk endeavors. Together, they studied. They analyzed police response times, armored car schedules, and bank layouts with the dedication of military planners. Their previous work included 2 armored car robberies that netted them over $1.5 million, confirming in their minds the validity of their methods. But their most formative experience came not from a success, but from a failure. In 1993, during a traffic stop in Glendale, California, police discovered their car laden with a small arsenal: automatic weapons, body armor, smoke grenades, and police scanners. They were arrested, but through a series of legal missteps and plea bargains, they served only a few months in jail and were released on probation. For law enforcement, it was a case closed. For Phillips and Matasareanu, it was a lesson learned. They concluded they had not been audacious enough. Their mistake was not in their ambition, but in their underestimation of chance. From that point on, their preparations escalated. They began to assemble a new arsenal, one designed not just to intimidate, but to dominate. They hand-sewed their own body armor, stuffing multiple layers of aramid cloth and thick, steel trauma plates into custom-made suits. This armor would cover their entire torsos, their groins, their shins, and their forearms. They were building suits of armor to make themselves invulnerable to the standard-issue sidearms carried by patrol officers. Their target for February 28th was the Bank of America branch on Laurel Canyon Boulevard in North Hollywood. It was a high-volume branch, and they had timed their arrival for 9:17 a.m., believing they would intercept a large cash delivery from a Brinks armored truck. They calculated they had an 8-minute window. The standard LAPD response to Mito enter, seize the cash, and escape before the first patrol car could arrive. Every detail was planned, every contingency considered. They were armed with their modified AK-47 and AR-15 style rifles, along with multiple handguns. They carried over 3,300 rounds of ammunition in drum and box magazines. They were not going to rob a bank. They were going to war with anyone who stood in their way. On that clear Friday morning, as they drove their white 1987 Chevrolet Celebrity towards the bank, a sense of cold confidence settled over them. They had done the work. They had the tools. They believed they were invincible. Inside the car, they took phenobarbital, a barbiturate meant to calm their nerves. Dressed in all black, their faces obscured by ski masks, they were two figures stepping out of a dark fantasy and into the mundane reality of a suburban morning. They were about to test their philosophy against the world, and in doing so, they would forever change the face of American policing. At approximately 9:16 a.m., Phillips and Matasareanu pulled up to the Bank of America. They checked their watches. The timing was perfect. As they exited the vehicle, their hulking figures clad in black, carrying rifles that belonged on a battlefield, they immediately drew the attention of a passing LAPD patrol car. Officers Loren Farrell and Martin Perello were on a routine patrol when they saw the two men, armed and masked, stride towards the bank's entrance. The 8-minute window Phillips and Matasareanu had counted on vanished before they even stepped inside. Officer Farrell immediately broadcast the fateful message over his radio. 15A43, requesting backup. We have a 211 in progress at the Bank of America, North Hollywood branch. The 211 California Penal Code for robbery was an understatement. Inside the bank, the scene descended into controlled chaos. Phillips fired a burst from his Norinco Type 56 into the ceiling, the deafening roar of the fully automatic weapon shattering the morning's calm. Glass and plaster rained down as terrified customers and employees dropped to the floor. "This is a fucking holdup," one of them screamed. "Everybody on the ground." They were brutally efficient. Matasareanu, with his imposing size, herded the nearly 30 people present into a single group, his rifle a constant, menacing presence. Phillips, the strategist, went to work on the tellers, demanding access to the vault. He was furious to learn that the Brinks truck had already come and gone earlier than scheduled. The vault contained significantly less cash than their intelligence had suggested. Undeterred, he forced the bank manager, John Villagrana, to open the vault. Phillips swept what cash he could, approximately $303,305, into a large black bag. In his haste, he also scooped up a die pack, a small, explosive device designed to ruin stolen money. Meanwhile, Matasareanu attempted to gain access to the bank's ATM. He fired dozens of rounds into the machine's armored housing, but the 7.62 by 39 mm bullets, designed to be effective against flesh and light cover, simply ricocheted off the hardened steel. His frustration grew. The plan was already veering off course. They were behind schedule, the take was smaller than expected, and the sound of distant sirens was growing closer, faster than they had anticipated. The first police officers to arrive on the scene, having heard Farrell's call, took up positions across Laurel Canyon Boulevard. They were patrol officers, armed with standard-issue Beretta 92 f9mm pistols and a few 12-gauge shotguns. They were trained for standoffs and containment, not for open combat with heavily armored opponents carrying military-grade automatic rifles. The moment the robbery turned into a battle was when Larry Phillips, realizing law enforcement was already outside, made a tactical decision. He walked to the bank's north entrance, pushed open the glass door, and calmly opened fire. The sound was unlike anything the officers had ever heard in an urban environment. The slow, deliberate pop-pop-pop of their handguns was answered by a continuous thundering roar from Phillips's rifle. His bullets, armor-piercing steel core rounds, tore through the thin metal of the police cruisers with terrifying ease. Windshields shattered, engine blocks cracked, and metal frames were shredded as if they were made of paper. The officers were pinned down, their sidearms utterly useless. Their 9mm rounds struck Phillips's body armor and flattened, having no effect. It was as if they were throwing stones at a tank. Civilians and officers alike were hit by the fusillade. Detective William Krulak was shot in the ankle. Officer Martin Whitfield, one of the first to engage, was struck in the shoulder and femur, the round shattering the bone and leaving him critically wounded and exposed in the street. The police radio became a frantic chorus of disbelief and desperation. "We have an officer down. Suspects are wearing full body armor. Be advised, they are firing an AK-47. My rounds are bouncing off the sky." The reality was dawning on every officer within earshot. This was not a crime scene. It was a war zone, and they were catastrophically outgunned. Inside the bank, Madasarianu heard the gunfire and knew their time was up. The dye pack in the money bag exploded, staining the cash and filling the bag with red smoke and tear gas. The heist was a failure. Now it was about survival. He grabbed the ruined bag of money and made his way to the south entrance. He too opened fire, engaging another group of officers and pinning them down, providing cover for Phillips. The two men now stood at opposite ends of the bank, creating a deadly crossfire that controlled the entire street. For 44 agonizing minutes, North Hollywood became a symphony of destruction. Phillips and Madasarianu fired an estimated 1,100 rounds, their movements calm and methodical. Phillips, in particular, seemed almost serene in the chaos he was creating. He reloaded his drum magazines with practiced ease, his body language communicating an absolute lack of fear. He advanced on police positions, forcing wounded officers to crawl for cover. He stood in the open, absorbing dozens of handgun rounds to his armored chest as if they were insect bites, and returned fire with devastating accuracy. The LAPD's response was one of desperate improvisation. Officers created makeshift barricades with their destroyed vehicles. Under a hail of gunfire, they risked their lives to rescue their wounded comrades, dragging them to safety. One of the most iconic moments of the shootout came when officers commandeered a citizen's armored truck that was passing by the scene, using it as a mobile shield to evacuate the wounded Officer Whitfield and other civilians trapped in the line of fire. The turning point of the battle began with the arrival of the first SWAT units at 9:52 a.m. Unlike the patrol officers, SWAT teams were equipped with AR-15 rifles. For the first time, law enforcement had weapons capable of challenging the robbers. As SWAT officers began to take up tactical positions in the surrounding buildings, the tide slowly began to shift. Phillips, still fighting in the parking lot, decided it was time to retreat to their getaway car. As he moved, his rifle jammed. While trying to clear the malfunction, he dropped the weapon. He drew a Beretta 92 FS pistol and continued firing, but he had lost his primary advantage. At the same time, a SWAT officer fired from a distance, and a round from an AR-15 struck Phillips in the hand, nearly severing his thumb and causing him to drop the pistol. Wounded, and with his main weapon inoperable, his invincibility began to crumble. He was hit multiple times by SWAT rifle fire in his unarmored areas, but the trauma was immense. Finally, seeing no way out, Phillips made his last decision. As SWAT officers continued to fire, a round struck his spine, severing it. At almost the exact same instant, he placed the barrel of his Beretta under his chin and pulled the trigger. The architect of the chaos was dead, his body collapsing onto the grass beside the getaway car. It was 9:56 a.m. The shootout had been raging for 40 minutes. As his partner fell, Emil Matasareanu's one-man war began. He had witnessed Phillips's death from his position at the south entrance of the bank. Realizing he was now alone, he retreated back into their Chevrolet Celebrity and attempted to start the engine. Miraculously, it turned over. The car, however, was already a wreck. 3 of its 4 tires had been shot out, and its body was riddled with at least 80 bullet holes. Matasareanu began a desperate, slow-motion escape, driving east on Archwood Street. The car crawled along on its rims, the screech of metal on asphalt adding to the cacophony of sirens. He fired bursts from his own modified AR-15, a Heckler & Koch 91 Hong Kong dollars clone, through the shattered windows, forcing pursuing officers to keep their distance. But his escape was doomed. The vehicle was barely controllable and moving at less than 5 miles per hour. It was a creeping target. 3 blocks away, near the corner of Archwood and Morella Avenue, the getaway car finally became undrivable. Matasareanu had a choice: surrender or make a final stand. He chose the latter. He exited the crippled Chevrolet, taking the rifle and thousands of rounds of ammunition with him. He took cover behind the car's engine block, using the disabled vehicle as a fortified bunker, and engaged a new group of SWAT officers who were closing in on his position. The second gunfight began. This was not the chaotic, multi-front battle of Laurel Canyon Boulevard. This was a focused, tactical engagement. SWAT officers, armed with AR-15s, laid down suppressing fire from behind trees and other vehicles. Matasareanu, despite the overwhelming odds, was still a formidable opponent. He was protected by the car and his heavy body armor, and he returned fire with disciplined bursts. For several minutes, a tense standoff ensued. The officers had him pinned, but approaching him was still incredibly dangerous. The end for Matasareanu came not from a single, dramatic shot, but from a calculated tactic. The SWAT officers, recognizing that his legs and feet were his most vulnerable points, directed their fire low. A volley of rounds found their mark in his unarmored lower extremities. Bullets tore through his feet, ankles, and legs. The massive trauma and blood loss were immediate and severe. Roaring in pain and rage, Matasareanu was finally brought down. His rifle clattered to the pavement. He collapsed onto the street, critically wounded but still alive. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. It was 10:01 a.m. The shooting had stopped. But for Emil Matasareanu, the ordeal was far from over. As he lay bleeding on the asphalt, SWAT officers cautiously approached, disarmed him, and handcuffed his hands behind his back. The scene was still considered hot. Police protocol dictated that paramedics could not enter an active or unsecured crime scene until it was completely cleared of any potential threats. There was still a fear of other suspects, or of explosive devices in the getaway car. For 70 minutes, Emil Matasareanu lay on the street, bleeding from at least 29 gunshot wounds. He was conscious, speaking with officers, and pleading for help that was not permitted to come. Police cruisers formed a perimeter, their radios crackling with updates. A news helicopter broadcast the scene live to a stunned city. On television screens across the country, people watched as a man's life slowly drained away on the pavement. Life ebbed away, minute by agonizing minute, from the multiple severe wounds to his legs. By the time ambulances were finally cleared to enter the scene and reach him, it was too late. Emil Matasareanu was pronounced dead at the scene. His death, long after the last shot was fired, would become a point of controversy and legal debate for years, a grim postscript to a day of unparalleled violence. The aftermath of the North Hollywood shootout was a scene of devastation. The streets looked like a war-torn city. 2 lives were lost, those of the robbers themselves. But the human cost was far greater. 18 people, including 11 police officers and 7 civilians, were wounded by gunfire or shrapnel. Dozens more bore the psychological scars of having been trapped in a firefight. Over 2,000 rounds of ammunition had been exchanged in 44 minutes. More than 300 patrol officers had responded to the call, a testament to the scale of the incident. In the subsequent investigation, police raided the home Phillips and Matasserianu shared. They found what they described as a robber's workshop. There were tools for modifying weapons, blueprints of banks, body armor in various stages of construction, and military strategy manuals. They discovered that the men had meticulously cased other potential targets, including multiple Bank of America branches and Brink's armored car depots. The depth of their planning confirmed what the LAPD had learned in the most brutal way possible. These were not impulsive criminals. They were disciplined, dedicated, and operating with a military-style doctrine of overwhelming force. The legacy of the North Hollywood shootout was immediate and profound. It served as a terrifying wake-up call for law enforcement agencies across the United States. The image of patrol officers with their 9mm handguns being utterly ineffective against armored, rifle-wielding opponents was seared into the national consciousness. The shootout became a crucible for American policing, forcing a fundamental shift in tactics, training, and equipment. Within months, the LAPD and other departments began a program to equip patrol officers with AR-15 rifles, placing them in the trunks of their cruisers to ensure they would never be so catastrophically outgunned again. Policies on body armor were re-evaluated, and funding was allocated for heavier, rifle-rated plates. The concept of active shooter response was refined, changing the old doctrine of contain and wait for SWAT to one of immediate engagement by the first officers on the scene to neutralize the threat and save lives. The echoes of that day on Laurel Canyon Boulevard still resonate. For the officers and civilians who survived it, it is a memory of terror, courage, and loss. For law enforcement, it is a permanent lesson, written in blood and spent shell casings, about the need to prepare for the unthinkable. And for the rest of us, it remains a chilling case study of how two men's cold, calculated philosophy of violence could erupt into a full-scale battle on a quiet suburban street, turning a bank robbery into a defining moment in the history of American crime. Case 2. The Norco Bank Robbery. 17 years before the firefight in North Hollywood, another Southern California town was turned into a war zone, in an event that would serve as a grim and largely unheeded prophecy. The Norco Bank robbery of May 9, 1980, was not born of simple greed, but from a far more volatile cocktail of apocalyptic faith, survivalist paranoia, and meticulous, military-style planning. The architects of this chaos were not merely robbers. In their own minds, they were soldiers of God, gathering supplies for an impending societal collapse they called the Time of Troubles. The leader of this small, armed sect was George Wayne Smith, a charismatic but deeply troubled man who had recently converted to a form of born-again Christianity. His interpretation of Scripture was filtered through a lens of extreme survivalism. He preached to a small group of followers that a great economic and social cataclysm was imminent, prophesied in the Book of Revelation. When this collapse occurred, only the prepared the righteous who had retreated from the corrupt world would survive. To prepare, they needed a sanctuary, a fortified compound in the mountains, and most importantly, they needed an arsenal. His most devoted disciples were 4 young men, brothers Chris, Russell, and Gary Harvin, and their friend Robert Steele. They were drawn to Smith's certainty in a world they found confusing and threatening. He gave them purpose, a narrative that framed them as righteous warriors in a coming holy war. Their preparations were extensive and obsessive. At the Harvin family home in Phillips Ranch, a suburb of Pomona, they stockpiled a breathtaking arsenal. They legally purchased semi-automatic rifles like the Heckler and Coke 91 and Colt AR-15, shotguns, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They also gathered components for and constructed dozens of improvised explosive devices. They trained relentlessly, practicing marksmanship in the desolate canyons of the Inland Empire. They studied police tactics, radio frequencies, and, most critically, response times. Their plan was not just to rob a bank, but to execute a complex military-style operation designed to overwhelm law enforcement and secure their escape to a pre-planned ambush site. They selected the Security Pacific Bank in Norco, a small, semi-rural community known for its horse trails and quiet atmosphere. They saw it as a soft target, the perfect place to acquire the funds needed to complete their mountain redoubt and wait for the end of the world. On the morning of May 9, 1980, the 5 men gathered for their mission. They were dressed in drab, military-style clothing and camouflage. They carried an arsenal that could have equipped a small infantry squad, 5 semi-automatic rifles, 2 shotguns, numerous handguns, and over 3,000 rounds of ammunition loaded into high-capacity magazines. They also brought a collection of homemade bombs. As they drove towards Norco in a stolen van, there was no sense of criminal nervousness, but rather a cold, zealous resolve. They were on a divine mission, and they were prepared to kill anyone who interfered with God's plan. At 3:40 p.m., they stormed the bank. The assault was sudden and brutal. Smith, the leader, stood guard outside while the 4 others, their faces covered with ski masks, burst through the doors, brandishing their rifles. The scene inside was one of sheer terror. One of the robbers fired a burst into the ceiling, showering the lobby with acoustic tile and dust. They screamed at the 24 customers and employees to get on the floor, their voices filled with a chilling authority. They moved with practiced efficiency. One man covered the terrified civilians while the others vaulted over the counter. They emptied the teller drawers, stuffing wads of cash into a large canvas bag. Their movements were aggressive and violent, but also disciplined. They were on a strict timetable, a countdown against the estimated police response. One teller, a young woman named Terry Lujan, kept her composure amidst the chaos. As one of the robbers shoved the bag towards her, demanding she fill it, she followed her training. Along with the cash, she discreetly slipped in a red dye pack, a small explosive device designed to detonate after leaving the bank, ruining the money and marking the criminals. It was a small act of defiance that would have catastrophic consequences. With nearly $20,000 in the bag, the robbers concluded their work. They had been inside for less than 3 minutes. They herded the hostages into the bank's vault, not to lock them in, but to delay anyone from sounding the alarm. As they exited the bank and scrambled into their getaway van, they believed their plan had been executed flawlessly. They were unaware of 2 critical facts. An employee at a bank across the street had already seen the takeover and called the police, and the clock was now ticking on the dye pack hidden within their loot. The first law enforcement officer to arrive was Riverside County Sheriff's Deputy Glenn Bolaski. He had been on patrol nearby when the call came in. As he pulled his cruiser into the parking lot, he saw the suspect's van careening out onto the street. At that exact moment, the dye pack exploded inside the van, filling the small space with a choking cloud of red smoke and tear gas. The robbers' disciplined plan instantly shattered. Blinded and choking, they erupted in a panic. Believing they were already under attack, they responded with the only tool they truly understood: overwhelming firepower. One of the men kicked open the van's side door and opened fire on Bolaski's patrol car with his -91 Hong Kong dollars rifle. The high-velocity 7.62 mm rounds tore through the vehicle. The windshield disintegrated. The dashboard exploded into fragments. Bolaski was hit 5 times, in the face, shoulder, and both forearms. His service revolver, a standard .38 special, was still in its holster. He never had a chance to draw his weapon. Critically wounded, he threw the car into reverse and managed to back out of the line of fire, crashing into another vehicle as he lost consciousness. He had survived the opening salvo of one of the most violent running gun battles in American history. The robbers, now in a full-blown panic, sped away, firing indiscriminately at anything that moved. Their meticulously planned escape route was now a trail of chaos. Police cars from multiple jurisdictions began to converge, but they were horrifically outgunned. The officers' .38 revolvers and 12-gauge shotguns were no match for the robbers' semi-automatic rifles and their huge supply of ammunition. The criminals' van, a rolling fortress, absorbed the officers' small-caliber rounds with little effect. In return, the robbers shredded the pursuing police cruisers, disabling at least 8 of them during the chase. A sheriff's department helicopter, Air 1, piloted by Deputy Daniel Archuleta, joined the pursuit from above. Archuleta tracked the van as it weaved through residential streets and onto the freeway, providing crucial intelligence to the units on the ground. But the robbers were aware of the aerial surveillance. One of them leaned out of the van, aimed his AR-15 at the sky, and opened fire. The helicopter was hit multiple times. One round tore through the cockpit, narrowly missing the pilot and his observer. With his controls damaged, Archuleta was forced into an emergency auto-rotation landing in a nearby field. The police had lost their eye in the sky. The chase now continued into a more rural area, heading towards the San Bernardino National Forest. This was part of the robbers' original plan. They were leading the police into a trap. They raced up a narrow, winding road into Lytle Creek Canyon, a place they knew intimately from their training exercises. Here, the terrain would give them the ultimate advantage. They abandoned their crippled van and took up prepared positions on a ridge overlooking the road, creating a perfect ambush kill zone. As the first police cruisers rounded a blind corner into the canyon, the robbers opened fire from their elevated position. The lead car, driven by Deputy James Evans, was caught in a devastating crossfire. His vehicle was hit dozens of times in seconds. A round from an AR-15 pierced the car and struck Deputy Evans in the head, killing him instantly. He was 35 years old and a father of 2. His partner, Deputy Andy Montemayor, was also hit but managed to crawl out of the vehicle and find cover, returning fire while bleeding profusely. The canyon became a death trap. Officers were pinned down behind their disabled cars, with rifle rounds whizzing over their heads and impacting the rocks around them. The robbers held the high ground, controlling the battlefield completely. For over 30 minutes, a desperate firefight raged. The officers, understanding they were outgunned, focused on rescuing their wounded comrades and holding their position until reinforcements could arrive. A SWAT team was en route, but they were still minutes away. The tide of the battle turned with an act of incredible bravery. A San Bernardino SWAT team arrived, and under the command of Sergeant Don Holland, they began a flanking maneuver, climbing the steep, rocky terrain to get above the robbers' position. At the same time, officers on the road below laid down suppressive fire, drawing the suspects' attention. As the SWAT team closed in, a close-quarters battle erupted on the mountainside. During the intense exchange of fire, one of the robbers, Chris Harvin, was shot and killed. Faced with the tactical assault from a well-armed SWAT team, the remaining 3 gunmen, Russell and Gary Harvin and Robert Steele, realized their stand was over. They threw down their weapons and surrendered. But the leader, George Wayne Smith, was gone. Under the cover of the intense firefight, he had managed to slip away into the dense woods of the National Forest. The immediate aftermath was a scene of chaos and grief. One officer, James Evans, was dead. 8 other officers were wounded, some critically. Civilian cars were riddled with bullet holes. The quiet canyon was littered with thousands of spent shell casings. An enormous manhunt was immediately launched for George Wayne Smith. For 2 days, hundreds of officers scoured the rugged terrain. He was finally cornered and captured, exhausted and dehydrated, but still defiant. The trial of the 4 surviving robbers was a landmark case. It was one of the longest and most expensive trials in California history at the time. The defense argued that the men were suffering from a form of shared delusion, brainwashed by Smith's apocalyptic rhetoric and further impaired by the large amounts of PCP they had consumed before the robbery. The prosecution painted them as cold-blooded killers who had planned and executed a terrorist act. In the end, the jury agreed with the prosecution. George Wayne Smith, Russell Harvin, and Gary Harvin were convicted of 46 felonies, including murder, and were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Robert Steele, who had cooperated with prosecutors, received a lesser sentence. The Norco robbery was a watershed moment for American law enforcement, though its lessons would take years to be fully absorbed. It was a brutal demonstration of the growing firepower gap between standard patrol officers and a new breed of heavily armed, ideologically motivated criminals. The sight of .38 revolvers being useless against rifle-wielding assailants was a terrifying preview of what the LAPD would face in North Hollywood. The event spurred initial discussions in police departments about the need to up-arm patrol officers with semi-automatic rifles and provide better tactical training for violent encounters. Long before active shooter became a common term, the 5 men in Norco demonstrated the catastrophic potential of combining military tactics, overwhelming firepower, and a fanatical belief system. They turned a quiet Friday afternoon into a protracted, rolling gun battle that left a community shattered and a police force mourning its dead. The Norco shootout was more than a bank robbery gone wrong. It was a declaration of war, a bloody chapter that served as a stark, violent warning of a new and more dangerous era of crime. Case 3. The Sacramento Good Guys. Hostage Crisis. The story of the Good Guys. Hostage crisis begins not with a grand ideology or a sophisticated criminal enterprise, but in the fractured identity and desperate ambitions of 4 young men adrift between 2 worlds. Loy Coc Nguyen, Pham Coc Nguyen, Long Hong Nguyen, and Quang Tran were part of the wave of boat people who fled Vietnam after the fall of Saigon. Their early lives were marked by the trauma of war, the peril of their escape, and the disorienting struggle of assimilation into American society. They had arrived in California seeking a dream, but found themselves in a reality of low-wage jobs, cultural alienation, and the sting of perceived disrespect. In the suburbs of Sacramento, they found each other. They were not all related by blood, but they were bound by a shared background and a common, corrosive resentment. They formed a loose-knit group they called the Oriental Gangsters, or OG. It was less a structured criminal organization and more a social clique built on a foundation of youthful bravado and a warped perception of power derived from American action movies. They saw violence and aggression not as a last resort, but as a primary tool for asserting the control they felt they lacked in every other aspect of their lives. Their plan was born of this desperation. It was tragically simple and profoundly naive. They would rob a large, successful business, take a massive amount of cash, and use it to buy the respect and lifestyle they coveted. Their target was the Good Guys, a popular electronics store located in a sprawling shopping center in South Sacramento. They believed it would be flush with cash from a busy day of sales. They armed themselves with a collection of handguns and a shotgun, but their most dangerous weapon was their immaturity. They were not seasoned professionals like the men in North Hollywood, nor were they zealous ideologues like the Norco robbers. They were volatile, impulsive, and utterly unprepared for the consequences of their own actions. On the afternoon of April 4th, 1991, they put their crude plan into motion. Just before 2 p.m., the four men, dressed in street clothes, burst into the brightly lit showroom of the Good Guys store. They fired shots into the air, the sound of gunfire instantly replacing the low hum of electronics and music. Panic erupted. The store was filled with more than 24 customers and nearly 20 employees. "Everybody down. This is a robbery," one of them screamed. Their initial intent was a quick takeover. They would herd everyone into a back room, empty the cash registers and the safe, and be gone in minutes. But their plan unraveled almost immediately. An alert store employee managed to trip a silent alarm, sending a signal directly to the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department. Within moments of the robbers entering the store, patrol cars were already en route. As the robbers began to collect cash, the first sirens became audible in the distance. A wave of panic washed over the four young men. Their window for escape had just slammed shut. Trapped, out of their depth, and with the sounds of approaching law enforcement growing louder, their simple robbery escalated into something far more dangerous. They rounded up every man, woman, and child in the store. 41 people in total and herded them toward the center of the showroom floor. These people were no longer witnesses. They were now hostages, their lives the only bargaining chips the robbers had left. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, led by Sheriff Glenn Craig, quickly established a perimeter, sealing off the shopping center. A command post was set up, and the department's top hostage negotiator, Sergeant Bill Witter, was brought to the scene. The siege had begun. Inside the store, the initial shock of the takeover gave way to a long, grueling ordeal of terror. The four gunmen, led by the eldest, Lloyd Gwynn, were erratic and unpredictable. Their moods swung wildly from aggressive posturing to moments of frightened confusion. They began making their demands over the phone to Sergeant Witter. Their requests were a chaotic jumble, revealing their lack of a coherent endgame. They wanted $4 million. They wanted a helicopter large enough to take them and several hostages to Thailand. They demanded a fleet of bulletproof vests. Bizarrely, at one point they even asked for a supply of ginseng tea, believing it would give them the strength and clarity to continue. To prove they were serious, they began a campaign of psychological torture. They would single out hostages, press guns to their heads, and conduct mock executions. They separated families, forcing parents to watch as their children were moved to different parts of the store. They forced one hostage, a store security guard, to act as their go-between, sending him to the doors to communicate with police, knowing he was a walking target. Among the hostages were siblings Sean and Aaron Wong, aged 22 and 20, whose family owned a restaurant in the same shopping center. They had simply been shopping. Another hostage was Chris Sohn, a 28-year-old store employee, a newlywed whose wife was pregnant with their first child. These were the ordinary people whose lives were now subject to the whims of four panicked young men. As the hours dragged on, the situation inside the store deteriorated. The robbers grew more agitated. They argued amongst themselves in Vietnamese, their alliance fracturing under the immense pressure. Lloyd Gwynn, the de facto leader, became increasingly tyrannical, both with the hostages and his own men. He felt his control slipping and responded with greater acts of cruelty. At one point, to show their resolve to the negotiators, they selected a hostage, a young man named Jeffrey Bryan, and shot him in the leg. His scream of agony was a message to the world outside. Their threats were real. The negotiators worked tirelessly, trying to build a rapport, to calm the situation, to find a peaceful resolution. But they were dealing with men who were not operating on a rational level. Every small concession they offered was met with new, more outrageous demands. The sun began to set on Sacramento, casting long shadows across the besieged shopping center. Over 8 hours had passed. The air inside the store was thick with fear and exhaustion. The robbers, wired on adrenaline and paranoia, knew that a peaceful escape was impossible. They began to talk about taking their own lives and taking the hostages with them. They gave the police a final deadline. If their demands were not met, they would start killing one hostage every 5 minutes. They began a countdown. Outside, Sheriff Craig and his command staff faced an impossible choice. The negotiations had stalled. The robbers were growing more violent and had just shot a hostage. Their threat to begin mass executions was credible. Waiting any longer could result in a slaughter. The decision was made to launch a tactical assault. The SWAT team, which had been positioned and rehearsing for hours, was given the green light. The plan was for a dynamic entry. The team would breach the store from multiple points simultaneously, using noise and smoke as a distraction, overwhelming the gunmen before they could harm the hostages. It was a high-risk maneuver, a desperate gamble to save the people inside. At approximately 10:40 p.m., the assault began. SWAT officers blew out the large plate glass windows at the front of the store with explosive charges. The concussions were deafening. Officers tossed in flashbang grenades, which erupted in blinding flashes of light and thunderous reports. Through the smoke and confusion, the SWAT team poured into the store, shouting, "Police, get down!" But the chaos that was meant to disorient the robbers also created a maelstrom of violence. The 4 gunmen, cornered and with nothing left to lose, did not surrender. They responded exactly as the sheriff had feared. They turned their guns on the hostages. The showroom became a killing field. In the cacophony of shattering glass, grenade blasts, and shouting, the distinct sound of gunshots filled the air. The robbers fired indiscriminately into the terrified groups of people huddled on the floor. The SWAT team returned fire, trying to neutralize the gunmen while navigating a room full of non-combatants. Hostages screamed, scrambled for cover, or lay frozen in terror, caught in a deadly crossfire. In those few terrifying minutes, the heist reached its bloody and tragic conclusion. When the shooting finally stopped, the scene was one of unimaginable carnage. 3 of the robbers, Loy, Pham, and Quang, lay dead, killed by SWAT team gunfire. But the cost to the innocent was devastating. 3 hostages had been executed by the gunmen. Sean Wong, the 22-year-old shopper, his sister, Erin Wong, 20, and Chris Sohn, the 28-year-old employee whose wife was expecting their first child. Another store employee, 24-year-old Fernando Gutierrez, was also killed. In total, 4 hostages were dead. An additional 11 were wounded, some by the robbers, others caught in the crossfire. The unborn child of Chris Sohn's wife also did not survive the trauma of the aftermath. In the confusion of the assault, the 4th gunman, Long Hong Nguyen, had managed to shed his weapon and disguise himself among the surviving hostages. He was led out of the store with the others, but his identity was soon discovered. He was the sole surviving perpetrator of the siege. He was tried, convicted of multiple counts of murder and kidnapping, and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The aftermath of the Good Guys siege left deep scars on the Sacramento community. It also sparked a painful and intense debate over the actions of the sheriff's department. While Sheriff Craig maintained that the assault was a necessary last resort to prevent a massacre, many questioned the tactics used. Allegations arose that some hostages had been hit by friendly fire from the SWAT team's weapons. Subsequent investigations, including one by the FBI, largely concluded that while the scene was chaotic, the fatal shots that killed the 4 hostages came from the gunmen's weapons. However, the controversy lingered, a testament to the tragic complexity of a situation with no good outcomes. The Good Guys. Crisis stands as a stark reminder of how quickly a poorly planned crime, fueled by desperation and youthful arrogance, can spiral into a national tragedy. It was not a battle against disciplined professionals, but a siege orchestrated by amateurs who were just as dangerous. The legacy of that day is not one of tactical lessons learned, but of profound loss, the loss of innocent lives, the loss of security in a community, and the loss of the American dream for 4 young men who chose to pursue it through violence, leaving only death and sorrow in their wake. Case 4. The Curse of the Brinksmat Gold. The robbery at the Brinksmat warehouse on November 26, 1983, was, in its execution, the antithesis of the bloody shootouts that define other deadly heists. There was no hail of gunfire, no high-speed chase, no protracted siege. The initial crime was a masterpiece of inside job precision, a quiet, almost sterile takeover that netted a gang of 6 men a staggering £26 million in gold bullion, diamonds, and cash equivalent to over £90 million today. It was, at the time, the largest robbery in British history. But the violence of this story did not erupt during the heist itself. Instead, it unspooled slowly, methodically, over the next 2 decades, a long, dark shadow that came to be known as the Curse of the Brinksmat Gold. The real homicide began long after the getaway. The plan was orchestrated by 2 prominent South London criminals, Brian the Colonel Robinson and Michael Mickey McAvoy. They were not street thugs. They were part of a generation of project criminals who planned their operations with business-like acumen. Their critical asset was Anthony Black, a security guard working at the Brinksmat Depot, a high-security facility near Heathrow Airport. Black was Robinson's brother-in-law, and over Sunday dinners and quiet pints, he was gradually persuaded to become their inside man. He provided the crew with detailed layouts of the warehouse, security protocols, and, most importantly, a key. Their initial intelligence suggested they would find around £3 million in foreign currency. They planned for a simple smash and grab. Shortly after 6:30 a.m. on that Saturday morning, the 6-man team, led by Robinson and McAvoy and dressed in security uniforms, arrived at the warehouse. Anthony Black, as part of the plan, opened the door to let them in. Once inside, they rounded up the other guards on duty. The takeover was swift and brutal, but not lethal. The guards were doused in petrol, a terrifying threat to ensure their cooperation. "Give us the keys or we'll set you on fire," was the chilling ultimatum. One of the guards, terrified, remembered the combination numbers for the main vault. When the massive vault door swung open, the robbers were stunned. What they found was far beyond their wildest expectations. There was no £3 million in cash. Instead, stacked neatly in cardboard boxes, were 6,800 gold bars, each stamped with the mark of Johnson Matthey bankers. Alongside the gold were platinum, diamonds, and traveler's checks. They had stumbled upon a treasure trove. Their small-time robbery had just escalated into the crime of the century. They quickly loaded their van with 3.5 tons of pure gold and vanished into the foggy London morning. The immediate investigation, codenamed Operation Midas, was massive. The first breakthrough came quickly. During the robbery, one of the guards had overheard the robbers addressing each other by their real names. Another guard recognized one of the masked men as Anthony Black. Within days, Black confessed, implicating Robinson and McAvoy. The 2 ringleaders were arrested, and in December 1984, they were convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. But this is where the story truly begins. The police had the ringleaders, but they didn't have the gold. All 3.5 tons of it had vanished. And this is where the curse took root. The stolen gold was too pure, too identifiable, to be sold on the legitimate market. It had to be laundered, melted down, mixed with other metals like copper to disguise its origin, and recast into untraceable forms. This was a complex, industrial-scale operation that was far beyond the capabilities of the South London gangsters who had stolen it. To transform their inert treasure into usable cash, they had to turn to a more sophisticated and far more ruthless level of the criminal underworld. They sought the expertise of a man named Kenneth Noy. Noy was a brilliant, charismatic, and utterly psychopathic criminal who specialized in handling stolen goods. Operating from the grounds of a sprawling, mock-Tudor mansion in Kent, he had the connections and the clandestine infrastructure to make the gold disappear. He set up a smelting operation in a shed on his property, melting down the Brinksmat bullion and recasting it. This new, disguised gold was then sold back into the legitimate market, often through unsuspecting jewelers in Bristol and Birmingham. The dirty money from these sales was then laundered through a dizzying web of offshore bank accounts, front companies, and shady property deals in London's Docklands and even Spain's Costa del Sol. The sheer volume of cash flooding the criminal ecosystem created immense tension. Greed, paranoia, and betrayal began to fester. The men who had stolen the gold and the men who were laundering it were all bound together by a toxic secret. And anyone who became a liability, or who was suspected of talking to the police, became a target. The curse claimed its first victim in January 1985. Detective Constable John Fordham, a member of the elite C-11 surveillance squad, was undercover on Kenneth Noy's property. Fordham and his partner were hidden in the gardens, watching the smelting shed, when Noy's Rottweilers began barking. Noy, alerted, came out of his house armed with a kitchen knife. In the darkness, he confronted Fordham. A struggle ensued, and Noy stabbed the officer 10 times, killing him. At his trial for murder, Noy brazenly claimed self-defense. He argued that he was terrified, believing he was being targeted by a rival criminal gang, and had no idea Fordham was a police officer. In a verdict that sent shockwaves through the British public and police force, the jury acquitted him of murder. However, during the investigation into Fordham's death, police had found 11 gold bars from the Brinksmat heist hidden on his property. Noy was subsequently convicted for his role in handling the stolen gold and sentenced to 14 years in prison. He had escaped a murder charge, but his connection to the cursed treasure was now undeniable. The violence was just beginning. The criminal underworld does not operate with a formal justice system. Its currency is fear, and its sentences are carried out with brutal finality. As the years passed, anyone associated with the Brinksmat gold seemed to meet a violent end. Charlie Wilson, one of the masterminds of the 1963 Great Train Robbery, had been tasked with laundering a portion of the Brinksmat proceeds. In 1990, he was living in Marbella, Spain. He was shot and killed by a hired assassin while grilling burgers by his swimming pool. It was believed he had lost £3 million of the gang's money in a bad drug deal. In 1996, the jeweler Solly Nahom, known as the Goldfinger, of the operation for his role in selling the disguised bullion, was shot dead outside his home in North London. He was the financial brain behind the money laundering, and it's believed he was silenced before he could trade information for leniency. In 1998, Gilbert Danny Mclars, a former associate of the gang, was found shot to death in his car in East London. He was suspected of being a police informant. The trail of bodies continued into the new millennium. George Francis, a former associate of the Cray twins who was linked to the laundering scheme, was shot dead in his car in 2003. Brian Perry, another underworld figure involved in melting down the gold, was shot dead in a South London street in 2001. The list grew longer, a grim litany of execution-style killings. At least 20 people connected, however tangentially, to the Brinksmat Gold have died violently. Even Mickey McAvoy, one of the original ringleaders, could not escape the curse after his release from prison. He had entrusted a share of the loot to associates, but when he tried to reclaim it, he found it had vanished into the complex web of criminal finance. He died of cancer, impoverished and embittered, in 2023. The legacy of the Brinksmat robbery is a chilling paradox. The initial crime was a bloodless success, but its aftermath spawned decades of murder and mayhem. It revealed the intricate and symbiotic relationship between traditional blaggers, armed robbers, and the sophisticated white-collar criminals who provide the financial machinery to legitimize their hauls. The 26 million pounds in gold acted like a radioactive isotope injected into the British criminal underworld, poisoning everything it touched. It is believed that a significant portion of the Brinksmat gold was never recovered. It was so effectively laundered that it is now part of the global gold supply. Anyone who has bought gold jewelry in the UK since 1983 is likely wearing a piece of the cursed treasure. The story serves as a profound and dark meditation on the nature of greed. The robbers sought a quick fortune, a shortcut to a life of luxury. But the treasure they stole was a dragon's hoard, and its curse ensured that very few would live to enjoy it. The bank robbery that seemed so clean, so perfect, became one of the bloodiest in history, not because of the violence of the heist, but because of the slow, corrosive homicide of its aftermath. We have journeyed through the chaos of North Hollywood, the fanaticism of Norco, the tragedy of Sacramento, and the long, dark curse of Brinksmat. These stories, though different in their execution, are united by a common thread: the volatile intersection of human desperation and extreme violence. They remind us that behind every headline and case file are real people, victims, perpetrators, and survivors whose lives were irrevocably fractured. The echoes of these events serve as a somber lesson on the true cost of crime, a price paid not just in stolen money, but in shattered lives and a loss of innocence that can never be recovered. May your nights be peaceful and your slumbers undisturbed.
Good night.